Hello, LGW friends, and maybe folks in Memphis who are signing on. As my LGW buddies know, I'm kind of a connector. I was a connector for 2013 before I moved home. It's kind of my natural inclination. At Hooks book events, we connect writers to organizations with new ideas. So what's exciting today is to kind of start making strengthened connections that are already here between Washington, D.C. and Memphis, Tennessee. Starting out, I'd like to give a shout out to Piper Davis of LGW, who actually introduced me to Russ. Before I moved home to Memphis, we had a really great call. I got all excited about what he's doing, which led to this conversation. As some of you also might know, Terry Freeman was the former president of the National Civil Rights Museum. She's an LGW member and is back up, I believe, in Baltimore. Russ's bride, Miss Tamika Hart Wigginton, is a Memphis native, but lived in DC. I think a lot of you all might know Tamika. She worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and now she's with Blue Meridian Partners. And of course, the National Civil Rights Museum is part of the Smithsonian family. So already this idea of connecting the two cities, there are already these wonderful things that we're here to strengthen today. So I'm going to briefly introduce Russ and then jump into some questions for about 20 minutes. And then we really want to hear from you all, asking Russ any questions about the museum, his personal story, and make this kind of an engaging conversation. So Russ just became president of the National Civil Rights Museum in August, and he's been there about 8 months. Before that, he had a very distinguished career at Rhodes College, his alma mater, which is a wonderful college here in Memphis. He was an educator and an administrator there. He had a stint at SCORE, which is where he met Piper, which is how I met him. So that was wonderful. He's also an author, which of course intrigues me. He's written a book called Strange Career of the Black Athlete, African, which sounds really interesting to me, and I kind of want to check that out. But what really struck me when I was doing the bio, I love this quote when he took this new job. He was also on the board of the Civil Rights Museum before he became president. But when he became president, he said, "During this critical time in our nation, the museum's physical place and all that it represents plays a vital role in understanding our nation's history in the areas of civil and human rights and how that impacts our nation today." So let's give a big welcome to educator, author, philanthropist, and very adored Memphian, Dr. Russ Wigginton. Welcome, Russ.
Thank you, Piper, for that very kind introduction. And I think I called you Piper.
That's okay. Look, I would love to be confused with Piper any day of the week.
Everybody wants to be Piper.
Everybody wants to be Piper.
Thank you so much, Perry. And it's been a joy to get to know you. And I love your passion and energy. And when you do the work that I try to do at the National Civil Rights Museum, so much of your fuel comes from others. And when you are like me and every morning you walk across the courtyard and look up at room 306, you get focused and you get inspired. And you know that the work that you have to do matters. It mattered historically, it matters today. And as importantly, it matters for how our world is tomorrow. Yesterday was April 4th, a very important day at the National Civil Rights Museum in our country and in our world. It was the 54th year in which, since Dr. King was assassinated. And so we have a commemoration ceremony. And we had a surprise visitor, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who is not in great health, but he was not going to miss the opportunity to honor one of his heroes and lifelong friend. And he's one of two people who are still living, who was on the balcony on April the 4th, 1968. So when you do the work that I do, the ability to have conversations, the ability to engage with people, the ability to help our society be the best that it can be, resonates every single day.
Thank you, Russ. There's a lot of going on at the museum I want you to talk about, but I think folks on the call would love to know a little bit more about your background, which I did some research on, and it's really fascinating. Your own kind of, your parents sort of, and more connections to DC, but I think your personal story is really worth telling the folks on the call today. So how about a little bit of that?
Absolutely. I am fortunate to still have both of my parents, Benny and Russ Sr. And I grew up in a household that valued education and valued it in a way that my parents made tremendous sacrifice for me and my two siblings to get what they thought was the best education that they could provide. And one of the things that is so inspiring to me and always has been is the varied backgrounds in which my parents had that were civil rights connected. So my mother was or is the one of six. Her mother died when my mother was 6 years old. And so they were raised by grandparents and other family members. When my mother was 18 years old, she was the legal guardian of her 15 and 14-year-old brother. She did not have the opportunity to go to college. However, throughout her early 20s, she was one of the leaders to help desegregate lunch counters in Louisville, Kentucky. She and my dad happened to coincide with a fellow you might have heard of, who they still call Cassius. That would be Cassius Clay, otherwise known as Muhammad Ali. They all went to middle and high school together and graduated together. My father, on the other hand, is the descendant of a woman who my grandmother, she and her other three siblings were all valedictorians of their high school classes, all earned master's degrees. Mm-hmm. Their father, so my great-grandfather, was the first African-American physician in Jackson, Tennessee. He was a Fisk, early 20th century Fisk graduate who also went on to Meharry. My father attended Howard University in 1960, and one of his dear friends and suite mate in college was a guy named Stokely Carmichael. And so my dad was right in the middle of Freedom Summer. And so I have these two varied background parents who in their own way found their voice as part of the civil rights movement. Little did I know as a child how intrigued I was with their story and their journey. And it led me to want to study and learn more about history in general. And that led me to major in history in college. And I went on to earn my PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and begin my career as a history professor back at Rhodes College.
Wow. It's like your DNA was just primed for where you're sitting right now. I know your parents must just be so excited and proud about this.
I think they are, and they also are in a position to give me a little feedback when they want to. So
okay, well, you gotta look. My mother's 91. I get it every day. It's fine. We're used to it. It's all good advice. So that's your story, but I think some folks on this call might not know the actual story of the museum itself and where it's situated in Memphis physically and the history of that. And if any of those slides you want to show, yeah, here we go.
Sure. So this is the entry for the National Civil Rights Museum, and behind it and to the sides are the actual motel, the Lorraine Motel, which was a very important residence for visitors to Memphis, Black visitors, because it's located off of Main Street. So in a prime location in downtown, one of few places that African Americans could stay. And so it was known from entertainers and famous people and to be the location where they stayed. And it's a place where Dr. King stayed frequently when he was in Memphis or passing through. And so the fact that the motel is still, it's really the centerpiece for our museum, really sends a powerful message. I often stand out front and greet visitors when they arrive, and they're intrigued by the fact that the hotel it still exists from the standpoint of its physical structure. And after Dr. King's assassination, the hotel fell in disrepair actually on the same day. It was a couple, Lorraine and Walter Bailey, hence the name Lorraine. Lorraine Bailey had a heart attack that same evening and passed. And the hotel fell into disrepair, and it stayed in disrepair for many years. And it wasn't until the late 80s that, so if you think 20 years, it became a eyesore for Memphis. Obviously, what happened there impacted Memphis and arguably continues to impact Memphis. But it physically was an eyesore for the city. But through the efforts of people like Judge DeArmy Bailey, who was not related to the family, and a few others, the idea of rejuvenating this as a tribute fundamentally to Dr. King and all that he stood for began to flourish. And the museum opened in 1991. And so we just celebrated our 30-year anniversary. And the museum's growth in attendance, recognition, respect around the world has really reached an all-time high. In 2019, the last full year of operation, the museum had 325,000 visitors. And what's interesting about that is about 75% of our visitors come from at least 125 miles outside of Memphis, and about 40,000 visitors a year are international. And so when you think about this being located in Memphis, that's certainly our home. Memphis loves the museum. Memphis is protective of the museum. But we are a destination for people all over the world. And every single day, I meet somebody who has traveled from a faraway place to come to the museum. I meet somebody just about every day who comes from another country and has come to Memphis to pay homage to this transformative leader and the surrounding comprehensive story that is civil rights.
When did it become part of the Smithsonian?
It became part of the Smithsonian about, I'm trying to remember the exact year. It's been about halfway through our 30-year tenure. That was through the efforts of a lot of great work done by the staff. And I have to say, there has been a relentless board leadership at the National Civil Rights Museum, people who have been part of the organization, investing their time, talent, and treasure into the museum over that span, which has put us in a wonderful position that we are able to be what I describe a living museum. We certainly have a tremendous amount of documents and exhibits. We have approximately 11,000 items in our collection. But we don't just passively display our exhibits. We have programming, we have educational opportunities and relationships and partnerships all over the country. And we engage in issues today that are civil and human rights related. And I think that gives us an opportunity to stay relevant, certainly because of what happened here. People would recognize it. just for that purpose. But the fact that we are able to continue to engage in civil and human rights issues, and we do so very actively, gives us an opportunity to stay relevant for future generations. One point I'd like to make is, in the next decade, there will be very few people left who remember exactly what they were doing on April 4, 1968. And so we have an obligation at the National Civil Rights Museum to share, present, and make relevant that story, because most people won't be familiar with it from a personal standpoint. And so we have some ideas and some strategies and some initiatives in mind in which to ensure that as we move forward as a country, we can still have this particular era and that particular moment at the top of mind for all of our citizens.
I love that, Russ. And without revealing my ripe old age, I remember I was a little girl and remember a lot of it quite vividly. So you talked about your Relentless board. You were a member of that Relentless board yourself. And then you became president. And I'm sure that's a shift of looking at it a different way. And you've only been there 8 months. And you and I talked earlier about that transition and how your approach to leadership and how you jumped in and what you've done, which is a lot in the last 8 months. I think these folks would enjoy hearing about that transition from board member to president and your process for getting to know the museum.
Sure. So I was fortunate to serve on the board for 10 years. I have about a 25-year relationship with the museum, though. So if you think about when I returned to Rhodes as a William Randolph Hearst Fellow in 1996, the museum was still in its infancy, still finding its full identity. And I was actually developing a course on civil rights at Rhodes. And as I was working on my syllabus, it hit me, literally 5 miles from here is the National Civil Rights Museum. Why don't I infuse in a deep way that museum into the course? And so I went and developed a relationship with the leadership at the time, and really got my energy for that course through a visit there and conversation, and we actually established the first formal internship that the museum offered with a college through that experience. And I was pretty much smitten with it ever since. Beverly Robinson was the president at the time. She now is the president of the Memphis area chamber. She was followed by a wonderful leader who you mentioned already, Terry Freeman, who welcomed me to stay on the board, and she and I developed a great, wonderful relationship. My relationship with the museum has allowed me to come in and think about it from multiple ways. I was very familiar with the programming, very familiar with the growth and maturation of our philanthropic and fiscal resources, and see an opportunity for us to take advantage of that wonderful leadership and foundation and truly catapult ourselves and center us in a national space that will allow us to be relevant today and tomorrow in distinctive ways that make sense for us to be in. As you mentioned, we do have Smithsonian affiliation. We have a level of credibility and legitimacy that gives us a dynamic platform by which to enter into some particular spaces that I would love to say a little bit more about if you think that makes sense.
Sure, I definitely, I want to hear that. And then I really want to go into the 3 pillars that you're working on, because I think is relevant to the audience. So whichever way you want to go about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would just just so people can see exactly what our vision is. First and foremost, we do preserve and honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we do a more comprehensive chronicling of the American Civil Rights Movement than often visitors assume. They think it's, some people think it's a monument to Dr. King, and he certainly is appropriately prominent, but it's a more comprehensive viewing of civil rights. And it really begins in the slavery era and works its way up through more present day issues. We fundamentally think that educating is part of our mission, hoping to inspire people to be active and to create positive social change. The three pillars that you mentioned are really the focus for our direction moving forward. And I believe we have the opportunity to be distinctive nationally through these three pillars. The first one is education. And we are, I mentioned our tremendous archive, which most people have never seen. We have documents, primary source documents that no one else has. They're distinctive in a real way. We have not digitized our collection yet. And so we have embarked on an initiative to digitize our entire archival collection with the primary purpose of building a civil rights curriculum through our lenses for the country. And I think this is particularly important at this time when we are, I would describe it as struggling as a country on how we teach civil rights, what we teach as part of civil rights, and arguably when we teach it. And I think when you have a place like ours that is rooted in facts and rooted in data and rooted in primary sources, and we don't need school board approval, we have the opportunity to lift up a story and a narrative that is comprehensive. And because if you've ever visited our museum, one of the things I hear repeatedly is that we meet people where they are in their civil rights education and knowledge journey. So we have experts, people who have deep knowledge who come to the museum every day. But we also have 14-year-olds who got dragged there by their parents who have no interest until they walk in the doors. And what we know is you can't tour our museum without seeing yourself, and finding a sense of community when you experience the museum. And it's that intersection of head and heart that really drive positive social change and people thinking of themselves as citizens who are expected to participate in our democracy. And so we also feel like we have a distinctive opportunity to lift up arts and culture. We're in a time now that I would describe as the rebirth of the Harlem Renaissance. So in the first time, or the most significant time in the last 100 years, there is a national attention and recognition of Black artists and artists of color through their art, the arts, and their writings and the cultural expressions. And so when you live in a city like Memphis, Tennessee, then you have to take advantage of that rich cultural history that we have. And so we are also going to lift up through the economic empowerment pillar, in particular, health equity and health inequity issues. Dr. King came to Memphis for the sanitation worker strike on his way to the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, as you all know. But really what made him make that stop to Memphis was because the sanitation workers who were killed didn't have benefits. They didn't have the resources for a proper burial. And that degree of economic exploitation, we think, is related to multiple other sectors where you could see where people don't always have the best opportunities to reach their full potential. And so we believe centering these conversations at the museum is really important. We're hosting a health equity summit that will bring some of the leading thinkers nationally to the museum, sponsored by some very influential national foundations, to come to Memphis, develop an action plan, identify best practices, develop an action plan, and produce some policy papers for how health equity policy and issues can be improved for the greater good. And so when you think about these three pillars, if we can channel our distinctive energies and attributes in this way, that will help ensure that the National Civil Rights Museum is relevant for years to come.
Well, and remind me, I believe you developed these all in the last 8 months.
Developed them in the last 8 months, but keep in mind, I had a particular lens in which to look through to identify these issues. Certainly, Terry Freeman had done an amazing job of putting in place the sort of structure that would allow us to focus in these three areas. There was work being done in all of these areas. What I'm doing is intentionally lifting them up in a particular way and centering them in national conversations at a time where I think working from a position of Dr. King's message of nonviolence and civility is really important. So we do have a unique opportunity to lead that conversation.
Well, I think I really want you to talk about next, and then we're going to open it up. But I think your Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Center, I think this Corporate Equity Center is so exciting, and I think really relevant to people at Leadership Greater Washington, or anybody who's listening in corporate America. This is so exciting. And I think how it got started, how it got funded, and what your goals are here, I think it's just fantastic. And I want to be sure everybody understands this.
Absolutely. I could not be more excited about the Corporate Equity Center, which was established. There's been work done on this over the last year and a half or so, and was officially brought to bear, if you will, late in 2021 through the generosity of AutoZone, which made a $5 million gift to establish the Corporate Equity Center. The first aspect of the Corporate Equity Center is the C-Suite initiative. And under the leadership of Bill Rose, the CEO of AutoZone, who also serves on the museum board, a deep passion to increase the number of Black executives and executives of color throughout corporate America. And what we have done is we're looking at this through a data lens, historic data lens, and from a neuroscience perspective. So we have developed our own unique DEI day and a half program in which the most senior corporate leaders for a corporation come to Memphis. They have a curated, intimate, dynamic tour that sets the tone. And then we have a full day of going through our curriculum in which we speak to all dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion that a corporation would care about. And I think it's important to note that we recognize that many of the goals of corporate America are to be profitable, to be successful through that lens. And so we have national consultants who we work with, one of whom spent 25 years on Wall Street. She was doing DEI work in the 80s, essentially, and has all this rich data that corporate leaders want to see to help them find specific ways or to use the tools that are there for how do you successfully recruit, retain, and advance leaders within your corporation, and actually those who do not use those practices, what their results are, that revolving door effect. And or people who are doing well at a company, and as probably many people on this call know, people who have a great future with their company, one day they come in and say, I'm leaving. And I'm leaving because I haven't felt valued. I don't feel like I belong, and my voice is not as relevant as it could be. And so we are dealing with real issues that are happening in companies every day. We're in the process of expanding to some other categories. One will be higher education in particular, and we will also develop a nonprofit sort of dimension, if you will, under this Corporate Equity Center umbrella. I believe this could be a tremendous resource for corporations across the country. We've got great feedback from those who've gone through it, and momentum for many more who are signing up to have this really unique experience through a DEI lens at the National Civil Rights Museum.
I love that. And so is this on your website at the museum? So if people on the call want to explore more about the details of it, is this available to them, or we could send it out?
That's exactly right. Yes. If you go to civilrightsmuseum.org, there is a link for the Corporate Equity Center. There is information that can help you learn more about it. And I have a managing director who leads this program, or myself, to talk about if you have a particular interest for your company to participate.
Wonderful. Well, I'd love to be a fly on the wall. I don't have a very big company, but actually I'm quite interested in this myself. So guys, start loading up the Q&A. I see we have one here. Okay, how can you get us more information about the Health Equity Summit? Good question.
Yes, so we are, a couple of things are going to happen with that. It's going to be a limited number of people who attend that. However, what we're doing is that what comes out of that center will be shared much more broadly. And so we have an interdisciplinary group of people, from economists to hospital leaders to city and public health officials, to folks in academia who will participate in this conference. So it's invitation only. We are still building that list, but the whole goal is to bring those folks together and create this first wave of lifting up what the primary topics are. It will not be the last opportunity to do this. I mean, it's really a foundation laying summit that we hope will garner interest beyond that, and then we will build that into our regular cycle of events each year.
Wonderful. Okay, guys, more questions. I have more that I can fill in, but please put your questions in the Q&A and I'll get to them. There are a couple of other interesting things happening there that you and I have talked about. One is the renovation of the Legacy building, and I think that's why you're in Nashville, Tennessee this morning. Am I correct?
That is correct. We are across the street from the main campus is a boarding house that the museum purchased several years ago, and it's actually the location where the alleged shot came from. And we currently have exhibits in that museum, but it was not a museum to be originally. So we're getting around to doing a major renovation of that museum and the Legacy Park, which is outside of the museum, to make that more community friendly. We completed a really significant renovation for the main campus in 2014. And so this will help align sort of the experience, if you will, by the project at the Legacy Building. And we have, we've worked closely with the state of Tennessee, who is demonstrating tremendous support to help us fund that, and really sees that as an important part of our state's identity. And when you think about the museum drawing 325,000 people to Memphis and to Tennessee, we're a valued economic engine for the region and for the state.
That's wonderful. I'm really very happy to hear that the state is giving you a significant, I think today, are you getting the money today, or is this just?
No. There's the session hasn't closed yet in Tennessee, but as budgets have been announced, it was exciting to see that the museum was listed as getting a significant support from the state. We certainly have philanthropic obligations to meet, and with through the work of my tremendous board and friends of the museum, we're excited about what this renovation will mean for the museum.
That's exciting. Well, listen, we got a great, Marla Dean has piped in from the Greater Washington Community Foundation, and she notes that they have a $95 million health equity fund here in DC. We would love to be a part of the Health Equity Summit. So I'm going to copy this in her email address for you, Russ, and get that to you before I lose it. Excellent, Marla, thank you so much. That's why we do this. We make connections and wonderful things like this happen. Love it.
Absolutely.
Okay, let me get back to the screen. The other thing you're working on that I'm personally interested in, because my 32-year-old son lives here and recently married. I'm now a mother-in-law, which is a whole new role I'm trying to figure out. But we talked about the 306 group, which I'm really excited about. Some people might not catch why it's called 306. But if you'll tell us a little about the 306 group, which I think is a marvelous idea.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up, Perry. So the Keepers of 306, and it's named after the room where Dr. Martin Luther King stayed, room 306. The Keepers of 306 are a really important committee that has been established over the years, and I have prioritized it, and I meet with this group monthly. It's young professionals, and it's their 21 to 40, and it's their participation, I should say young people, and that covers a broad spectrum of 21 to 40-year-olds. We need their voice, we need their perspective, we need their insight and expertise if we're going to be a vibrant museum tomorrow. The people who visit the museum have to see themselves, have to have some way of connecting to that story of yesterday if they're going to see it as relevant for today and tomorrow. And so we hosted a reception, and actually this summer we will kick off what will be an annual event called Keepers of 306 Day. And it will be a full day of programs and conversations and entertainment, all from 21 to 40-year-olds. So they will essentially have a day at the museum in which they are the architects of what happens. And it will be a celebration. And I think it's just really important for us to lift up young people. I think people often forget that the people who drove the movement were essentially college students or college-age people. And every time I mention that to that age group, I think some of them know it, but they still seem shocked because the work, the sacrifice, the courage that was displayed during the civil rights era were people just like them. They were their age. I like to describe them as powerfully naive, right? They believed in what the possibilities could be. and they were willing to make all kinds of sacrifices in order to see that come to fruition. And so the Keepers of 306 is a group that I'm very excited about, and see them really as the future of the museum.
That's marvelous. Is that also on the site as well? So I can send it to my kids.
The Keepers of 306 is also on the site. I am fortunate that I have a key staff member who qualifies as a Keeper of 306 member.
Okay.
He is the point person for that group, and we are working on our more national marketing plan for the Keepers. While it's based in Memphis right now, there will be an expansion of that, so people will be able to join that group from all over the country.
I love that. I was sort of thinking, could this be bigger than just Memphis? I like that. That's wonderful. We have another question. Do you have any thoughts on how Reverend Dr. King's words, mission, and legacy are often misstated today? Most do not know that Dr. King had a low approval rating at the time of his death.
That's a great question. And in fact, in Gallup polls taken right before his death, probably a year before his death, he had about a 35% approval rating. And I do think that's important to know. Certainly, it's important for us to capture him in a comprehensive way. And we do that, and we take that very seriously. He was not popular at the time of his death. 1 year prior to the day is when he gave his address at Riverside Church, where he was at his most radical and most outspoken about the Vietnam War and about the poverty and what he described as the systemic exploitation of people through their wages and their treatment. And this made him unpopular, and not just unpopular among folks who non-African Americans. He wasn't terribly popular among many Blacks, particularly middle class and economically well-to-do. And so it's important for us to see him through these particular lenses. But he was relentless and committed to a purpose. The Poor People's Campaign was not a popular movement, because that was one of those areas that crossed racial and ethnic lines. And if you were to galvanize and have people think about their particular economic plight, then that could be troublesome for the sort of structure, if you will, of the late 1960s. So we do spend time with his speeches throughout our exhibits. People get to hear what he said, which is often counter or perceived to be counter to some of the aspects of his speeches that are often lifted up, particularly on MLK Day. But he was all of those people. He was all of those things as an individual. But fundamentally, he was willing to do whatever it took for all people to be treated with dignity and respect, popular or not.
Oh, yes. Here's another question, kind of related to that. There continues to be an invisibility to structural racism and a dismissing of the reality of unconscious bias. Do you see any role that the museum can or should play in addressing this deficit?
All day, every day. Absolutely. In this Corporate Equity Center, one of our consultants is a neuroscientist. And so we have a significant part of that training is talking about unconscious bias. And it's hard to change the status quo. If you ask most people if they're open to change, they will say yes, as long as it's somebody else. Even if the familiar is not working, the familiar is still, for many people, most of us, our deferred sweet spot. And so what we're talking about, it's also important to think about one of the things, our first exhibit is really a addressing the institution of slavery and the economic foundation in which it was formed. I ask people all the time, how long did the institution of slavery last in this country? Rarely do people say 250 years. And so think about that. We have another century to go before African Americans were free as long as they've been enslaved in this country. Just think about that. Not a decade, but another century. And so when you think about 250 years of that system, we are still on a journey in which the transformation to remove ourselves fully from that system is underway. And so I think it's what has to happen. It's a combination of it's almost, I like to equate it to, for those of you who golf, it's like the hurry up and wait that happens on the golf course. You're trying to hurry up and get off the hole so the next group can play, so you can go stand on the tee box and wait your turn, right? And a lot of this, the process, it's sometimes it's one step forward and two step back. But there has to be a relentlessness. There has to be multiple ways and approaches to address racism and exploitation. There's not a silver bullet or a quick fix. How can you wave a wand and fix a system that for 250 years was rooted in a diametrically opposed system? So it takes patience with some sprinkles of urgency. And we try to highlight all of that complexity through the museum experience, through our programs, and through the pillars that I've mentioned earlier.
Well, thank you, Russ, for that. I think we've got time for one more question. Thank you for your insightful remarks, Dr. Wigginton, and for all the work you do. Do you have any thoughts on what, quote, moderate whites and everyone else too can do today to further Dr. King's legacy and missions?
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts I would share. The first thing I would do is encourage everybody. I do this annually, if not more, to go read the letter from a Birmingham jail. Don't run away from that. It is an eloquent document. Essentially what it's, I mean, I can't sum it up, but one of the key components of what it says is, however you describe yourself, and I think these are fuzzy, loaded terms across the spectrum. What does it mean to be conservative? What does it mean to be moderate? What does it mean to be liberal? I'm not sure. What I can tell you though is, if you don't fundamentally believe that everyone, regardless of any of the ways in which we separate and divide people, is legitimate and has value, if you can't come to terms with that, to me, I think sliding into those particular categories it's an easy way out. 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 It's an easy way That has nothing to do with how you think about economic policy or the role of the government. That has nothing to do with it. This is about fundamentally thinking that every human deserves a legitimate chance to reach their full potential, and the recognition that not everybody starts from the same place. And regardless of where you start, if you're committed to humanity, then you will point out ills, you will do the best that you can to address wrongs, and you will take courageous steps, whatever that means for you in your community or in your context, to challenge when you see those things are at play. So I would say that's not just what moderates can do, that's what we can all do. And if you're doing that to the best of your ability, I wouldn't say these things are going to go away tomorrow, but we are on a very different trajectory as a country. And if the least of us, as that group grows, it's hard to imagine how we as an entire society can reach our full potential if there are so many people who don't have hope and don't have possibilities.
Well, that is a wonderful way to end this conversation, Russ. Thank you. I'm re-inspired. Going to pull out my copy of the letter and take it on a trip this weekend and reread it. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, great friends at LGW, for supporting this idea of connecting Memphis and DC with Russ's inspiring conversation about the National Civil Rights Museum. And Russ, dare I say, please, y'all come down and see us.
Absolutely. When you come to the museum, come see me.
Yes.
I'd love to meet you.
Great.
So Perry, thank you very much for arranging this for us. Dr. Wigginton, thank you so much for being here and being part of this great session we had today. We are going to put a evaluation form in the chat. So please, everybody, you could fill that out. We're always looking for feedback on how we can improve things. But what a great discussion. What a great way to end. Letter from a Birmingham jail. We'll all put that down on our to-read list. We've got a lot of motivation, a lot of inspiration from today. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Everybody. Thanks, Russ.
Sure.